Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Research Project series of Bright on Buddhism. Today we will be discussing Yōkai, a very fun and well-known aspect of Japanese culture and folklore. Yōkai are everywhere in Japanese media and culture, and they have some very unique and compelling characteristics. In this episode, we will discuss what the Yōkai are, where they come from, and how we ought to understand their place in Japanese culture. This episode owes a lot to the work of Michael Foster in his book, The Book of Yōkai, Mysterious Creatures of Japanese Folklore. In turn, just like Michael Foster's book, it will also draw on the work of Kunio Yanagita and Kazuhiko Komatsu, two incredibly significant Japanese folklorists. In particular, Kunio Yanagita is hailed as the father of Japanese folklore studies in a scholarly context, and much of how we think about and describe the Yōkai is as a result of his work. We will describe a little bit more about the birth of Japanese folklore studies and the work of Kunio Yanagita later on in the episode. Let's look at the name of the Yōkai. The first kanji in the name, Yō, means something like attractive, bewitching, and calamitous, and Kai means suspicious, mysterious, and sometimes even refers directly to ghosts. Thus, Yōkai are a class of supernatural or preternatural creatures and spirits that are prevalent in Japanese myth and folklore. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different Yōkai that come up in different artwork, literature, and orally transmitted legends, and they all have unique characteristics, personalities, and functions, especially in the worldview of the myths and legends that they come up in. These monsters and more have served as the inspiration for all kinds of Japanese media, including, for example, the monster hunting and collection genre. We can look at Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Monster Hunter, and more, and see the Yōkai there. As an example, the Pokemon Ninetales is a direct adaptation of the Kyubi no Kitsune, or the nine-tailed fox spirit. In addition, the Tengu are everywhere in Japanese pop culture. Several Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters are based on the Tengu. Tanjiro's teacher Sakonji wears a Tengu mask in the popular Demon Slayer anime. Isshin Ashima dresses as a Tengu when he sneaks out to kill his rivals in the video game Sekiro. And there's even a Tengu emoji. There is even a connection between the Yōkai and Quentin Tarantino, which I'll give at the very end, so stick around for that. As you can see, the Yōkai are very culturally significant and influential on media all around the world. I can't wait to get started. So, let's start at step 1. What actually are the Yōkai? We already said that they are supernatural spirits or entities, but that's only the most cursory way to describe them. There's so much more to them than just that. They arise out of a very particular social, cultural, historical, and religious context. To better understand that context, we need to look back into the tradition of kami worship that we now call Shinto. If you remember from our reading of the origin myths of Japan, there were a variety of entities called kami, and their character was attributed to the forces of nature that they represented. While many things in the Kojiki and Nihonshoki were inventions or otherwise distillations of different and disparate kami traditions, one theme that applies very widely to the Japanese social and historical context and the religious context from which those texts arise is the theme of animism. Animism is the name that religious scholars ascribe to traditions that personify and deify objects and forces of nature. Gods or spirits in the wind, the trees, the earth, the rivers, the mountains, the storms, the harvest, plague, etc. Animism isn't a perfect term, and it doesn't apply perfectly to early Japanese religion, but it does speak to an idea that many pre-modern peoples the world over carry, which is that the land that they live on is subject to forces that they cannot fully understand or control, and thus must be populated by and subject to the will of beings that also we cannot fully understand or control, and are somehow different from us. The stronger and more mysterious the forces, such as the weather, the harvest, the seasons, natural disasters, then the stronger and more mysterious the being that must have control over those things. Additionally, these stronger and more mysterious forces must be worshipped and propitiated in order to maintain relative order of the universe. We must do rituals to preserve good weather, to encourage a good harvest, to ensure the proper passage of the seasons, to prevent natural disasters, and more. These forces become personified and deified into what we call the kami. The smaller but equally unexplainable phenomena need not be worshipped or personified into this thing we might call a god, but rather they must be coexisted with, managed, and warned of. It's in these smaller phenomena that we can begin to see the yokai emerge. Looking at the larger phenomena to which the title of kami is applied, there are large community-sized rituals that occur in an organized religious context, and they occur on a regular basis for the purpose of preserving the health and prosperity of the whole community. They attempt to manage the weather, the harvests, prevent natural disasters, prevent drought and pestilence, and keep all of these mortal dangers in the world at bay. Just because the smaller phenomena that we've been talking about did not spell moral danger for a community doesn't mean that there was no ritual engagement with them at all. It just means that it wasn't on such a large scale. For example, there were rituals that took place in the home to purify the hearth, prevent vermin and small-scale misfortune, and even worship rituals aimed at lesser kami that were protectors of domestic things and of people in the home and of one's family. These rituals were done on a level with saying grace over a meal, as many do in the West, or throwing spilled salt over one's shoulder, or knocking on wood. These aren't life or death beliefs about real and present dangers in the world, nor should they be viewed as stupid superstitions for stupid people. They're more like learned behaviors that are unexplainable and yet need no explanation. They are human acknowledgments of our own humanity. They're not done out of fear or out of being misinformed. They're just small acts that factor into a larger feeling of control and security over one's life in some way, even if it's minor and inconsequential. When looking at rituals and practices like this, we should not look back onto pre-modern peoples and say they were stupid. They did these rituals because they didn't know or have science. This is an unfair way to talk about people in the past. In general, in history, it's widely agreed upon that we need to look upon people in the past as being as smart and as informed as we are, but they were just using different tools and using different ways of thinking to approach the world than we are now. While we approach things with science, rationalism, empirical thinking, and so on, back then they approached the world with these more abstract concepts and these more abstract feelings and rituals aimed at preventing calamity. We have this culturally agreed upon way of thinking that we approach the world with, and they had their own culturally agreed upon way of thinking. And so how are we any different? Historically speaking, the thought process was that if these observances weren't kept, then the result could be bad luck, illness, rotten food, missing food, vermin, broken or disappearing household items, experiences like depression and melancholy, infertility, illness, and on it goes. These are abstract challenges and issues. Their occurrence is abstract, and in some cases it can be unexplainable. Sometimes there isn't even a reason for the occurrence of something like that. It just happens spontaneously. Nevertheless, staving off those experiences and those minor calamities is very important. We wash our hands to stave off illness. We clean our kitchens to stave off vermin. We protect our stored food, and so on. Pre-modern peoples were trying to accomplish the same goals, but they just didn't do it in quite the same way that we do them now. Not knowing about germs or proper food storage, the reason for things like illness and rot occurring were less clear to the people experiencing them. And those reasons, those causes, mysterious and unexplainable as they were, became categorized as the yokai. Additionally, it doesn't just apply to phenomena in the home. It also applies to things that happen alone out on the road, being deep in the forest, etc. In the West, in pre-modern times, people would speak about devils or demons or bad luck spirits. In Japan, these same ideas were personified into what we now call the yokai. The process by which an event with no clear or obvious cause becomes objectified or categorized as a yokai is what Michael Foster calls event becomes object. I put my rice into an elevated, cool, dry cupboard, and when I look next, it's rotten. I'm walking on the road and I trip and fall, but when I look back, there was nothing on the path to trip on. I drop what I'm carrying 4 times in a row for no observable reason. These are all events. They become objectified into this category of mysterious, animistic things called yokai. The event itself is not necessarily mortally dangerous or catastrophic, but if left unaddressed, it can turn into something much more serious and dangerous. One day of feeling not yourself can lead to debilitating illness or debilitating melancholy. A mysterious encounter on the road can be completely harmless or it can be deadly. What happens to somebody deep in the forest can be enlightening or result in you disappearing off of the face of the earth without a trace. Once strangeness was objectified in this way, the next historical step that it took was to be personified. So, these objectified events that we call yokai began to take shape as creatures, as sentient beings of some kind. And these creatures, these beings, take on their own role and status in the myths and legends that spread around in visual art, literature, and oral tradition. We will revisit this part in more concrete terms soon. But first, let's look at the actual historical context, as it exists in the texts that we have. The term yokai first appears in a myth history that's authored around the same time as the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The work is called the Shoku Nihongi, and by the time of its authorship in 772 Common Era, the yokai were in the everyday worldview of the Japanese elite who were involved in the compilation and authorship of the text. The history describes performing purification rituals to prevent the yokai, which are interpreted as just being strange occurrences that could not be explained. As yet, the unexplainable events have become objectified as the yokai, but they still haven't taken on these character roles. They haven't been narrativized or fictionalized yet. So, at this point, there would be no visual artistic depictions or narrative descriptions of the yokai in a personified or distinct form. Yokai was just the name for mysteries, small and large. Their appearance in this genre of texts, this courtly myth history, speaks to the fact that they must have been prevalent in the oral tradition of spoken myths, legends, and folklore. Thus, as more and more oral tradition was put to paper over the course of history, the yokai differentiated, and they were further described and explained. As Buddhism became more and more popular, and more closely related to the political power of the Japanese state, Buddhism incorporated a lot of the folklore surrounding the yokai, and sought to bring their management, prevention, and control under the purview of the Buddhist teaching. From our regular episodes of Bright on Buddhism, where we have discussed the Buddhist cosmology, you'll know that in that cosmology, the world is populated not just by humans, animals, gods of various kinds, but also by various kinds of spirits and various kinds of creatures that are not animals, not humans, and are not visible to everyday people. For example, we have the hungry ghosts, or the preta. As Buddhism grows in popularity and incorporates the religious traditions of all of the different places that it travels to, it will begin to look at the yokai in a similar fashion that it looks at the hungry ghosts, or the preta. And in that regard, Buddhism plays a huge role in the characterization of this object we call yokai. In Buddhism, the yokai were viewed as being inherent to the land of Japan, and the rituals surrounding them were imagined as rituals for enlightening or teaching the Buddhist Dharma to the yokai and neutralizing them as forces of misfortune in the life of each individual in the community. This is identical to how preta and hungry ghosts were handled all throughout Buddhism's history, leading up to its being imported to Japan. Simultaneously, as classical Japanese literature continued to develop in the Heian period, the yokai figured in that literature more and more. In particular, from the 9th century Common Era onward, one of the more popular genres of long-form literature, known as the monogatari, or the tale, T-A-L-E, featured yokai a lot. For example, we can consider the Konjaku Monogatari, or the Tale of Times Now Past. This was a collection of over 1,000 stories written in the late Heian period and compiled later on in history. In it, we see the first depiction of the Hyakki Yagyo. This is the famous parade of 100 yokai. In one of the stories of the Konjaku Monogatari, we follow a Fujiwara minister's son as he walks to his lover's place during the reign of Emperor Jogan, who reigned from 859 to 877. While on the road, this Fujiwara minister's son sees 100 demons, creatures, entities of various forms parading down the main street and making a ruckus. In later illustrations and visual depictions of this scene in the Konjaku Monogatari, these little demons will sometimes take the form of anthropomorphized household items. In others, they will be little unidentifiable creatures and critters. In other versions, they may look like preta from Buddhism. And in other versions, they may be little ghosts or spirits taking on some scary form. In some depictions, they may be carrying drums or tools or weapons or stringed instruments or stolen items and more as they parade through town. Michael Foster describes the hyakki yagyo as a terrifying eruption of the supernatural into the real world, and that's exactly how this was supposed to be interpreted. It's sort of like All Hallows Eve, where all the demons come out and play. In the story, in the Konjaku Monogatari, the yokai started to accost the Fujiwara minister's son, but he was coming from court, and he had his rank written out on his court attire. Once the demons saw that, they left him alone, because they saw that he was too high-ranking to be messed with. From this point onward in history, the yokai became cemented as characters and fixtures in Japanese literature. To that end, at this point in history, the study of yokai becomes so much more complicated. Here's why. In an oral tradition that remains oral for the most part, of course there are many different versions of pieces of folklore, but the extent to which those stories are informed and modulated by the happenings of the real world is mostly intuitive. As an example, if there's a legend where a yokai possesses a woman after giving birth to her child and makes her melancholic, then we can say, pretty easily and intuitively, that that myth could be an attempted explanation of the spontaneous and unexplainable event that we now call postpartum depression. When the yokai enter the literary canon, however, then the oral traditions become informed by the literature, and the literature becomes informed by the oral tradition, and on in a feedback loop. That means that changes or variations emerge in text or in oral legend that are allusions, with an A, to one or the other, and thus represent the result of a conversation between something fluid and something nebulous, namely oral tradition and culture, and something static and fixed, namely text. Maybe a storyline is borrowed from text and incorporated into the oral folklore, or vice versa. So if you see something that you want to understand deeper, then to find its origins, you have to go through several different recursions of oral tradition influencing literature, which itself was influenced by oral tradition, and so on. In that way, the literary canons are not just the texts themselves. They're also composed partially of the surrounding oral folklore that inform and are informed by those texts. In that case, the study of folklore becomes anthropological and cultural as much as textual. It calls on the scholar to become a participant observer as much as a textual analyst. That being the case, each scholar of yokai who studies them and asks people about them and reads about them will come back with a different perspective on the yokai, and with different oral legends or different versions of the same oral legends to talk about. Let's continue on with our historical narrative. The Kamakura, Muromachi, and Azuchi Momoyama periods of Japanese history, which spanned from 1185 to 1600, represent what most would call the medieval age of Japanese history. During this time period, the monogatari genre of literature that was so popular in the Heian period continued to flourish and actually began to be written down and compiled. In addition, other genres and formats of literature emerged and began to flourish as well. One example is emakimono. E means picture or illustration. Maki means a hand scroll or a roll of paper. And mono just means thing. So, emakimono are illustrated hand scrolls that usually tell a narrative story of some kind. Emakimono are marriages of calligraphic art and visual art, with many of the illustrated images becoming very famous in their own right. These emakimono contain some early landmark illustrations and narrative depictions of the yokai. One example is the Oeyama Ekotoba Shuten Doji Emaki. This is a tale about an oni, or a demon king, which is a class of yokai. In particular, it's the tale of his defeat by a Minamoto hero. It follows Minamoto no Raiko. This name, Minamoto no Raiko, is a nickname for Minamoto no Yorimitsu. For reference, Yorimitsu is 6 generations back in the Minamoto clan from Minamoto no Yoritomo, who figured very prominently in our narration of the Genpei War. This story follows his defeat of Shuten Doji, the Oni demon king. This emaki comes from around the 14th century CE, and the story that it tells is set in Kyoto during the reign of Emperor Ichijo, during the Heian period. Ichijo reigned from the late 900s to the early 1000s. So, let's describe the narrative of this story. In Kyoto, a bunch of women begin to go missing, and a famous diviner named Abe no Seimei, who uses a method of divination that is centered around yin-yang philosophy and is called in Japanese onmyodo, determines that the culprit is Shuten Doji, this Oni demon king who lives up on Mount Oe. The emperor sends Minamoto no Raiko and 3 of his friends to go defeat Shuten Doji in 995. They leave, and they first have an encounter with 4 other guys who turn out to be shape-shifted versions of kami looking to prevent intruders into the mountains. Mount Oe is a sacred mountain, and so not just anybody can go there. To avoid being prohibited from entry by the kami, the Minamoto crew disguises themselves as Shugendo practitioners to get by. In the interaction, one of the 4 kami gives the crew a barrel of sake to bury on the mountain in typical Shugenja fashion. Then the crew continues on. In their next encounter, they find one of the kidnapped women washing their clothes in the river. And when they talk to her, she tells them that the kidnapped women are acting as maidservants, sex slaves, and even as food for Shuten Doji and his attendants. The Minamoto crew proceeds, and they meet the Demon King in his court. The Demon King invites them in for a feast, and he begins to drink and tell his story. His name is Shuten Doji, which means guy who drinks a lot of sake, because he likes to drink a lot. He tells the Minamoto crew that he and his cabal were apparently displaced from Mount Hiei when the famous Enryakuji Buddhist temple complex, which is centrally important to Tendai Buddhism, was built there. In the Heian period, whenever any Buddhist temple was built with state sponsorship, there was almost always a ritual to banish the evil spirits and to banish the yokai from the space where the temple would be, or otherwise to enlighten them and ask for their support in building the temple space. The exact same thing happened at Mount Koya with the construction of Kongobuji, the headquarters of Shingon Buddhism. Anyways, the Minamoto crew gives Shuten Doji some of the sake that they were given in their earlier encounter that they were supposed to bury on the mountain. And this makes him even more drunk. And he passes out. And he actually de-shapeshifts and reveals his true form. When he de-shapeshifts, he's described as being 50 feet tall, having red skin, a 5-horned head, 15 eyes, and multicolored limbs. While he's passed out, the Minamoto crew, now aided by the 4 kami that they met earlier, go into Shuten Doji's bedroom, and Minamoto no Raiko decapitates him. However, Shuten Doji's head remains alive, and it attacks Minamoto no Raiko, trying to bite him in the head. Minamoto, being a folk hero as he is, had anticipated this, and he had put on 2 of his crew's helmets in addition to his own helmet, and this protected him. Thus, he succeeded in defeating Shuten Doji, and he took the head back to the Uji no Holzo, or the Uji treasure house, back at Byodoin Temple. This, as we know, is a very historically significant place because 100-ish years later, Prince Mochihito and Minamoto no Yorimasa would be run down by the Taira forces after the first Battle of Uji. The Emaki illustrations of this story contain very striking images of Minamoto no Raiko using his sword, Doji Giri, to kill Shuten Doji. Doji Giri means Shuten Doji killer, and the sword is actually on display at the Tokyo National Museum. It's one of the Tenka Goken, or the 5 swords under heaven, and it's considered a Japanese national treasure. I've seen the sword in person, and let me say that it is a sight to behold. It's very cool, and I highly recommend that people go visit the Tokyo National Museum and see it. It is fantastic, and the rest of the museum is fantastic as well. Let's look at another famous example of an emaki that contains legends and depictions of the yokai. Let's look at the Dojoji Engi Emaki. For context, engi are tales or fables that tell mythical histories of a temple or sacred space, and these stories usually have some sort of didactic aspect. They usually begin with the story leading up to the foundation of the temple or the shrine there, and they describe notable events in the space's history. Didactic is used here to mean that the stories intend to preach or demonstrate some sort of religious moral in the story. Engi literature is a subgenre of emaki mono. Anyways, the Dojoji Engi Emaki is very famous. It tells the history of the Dojoji Temple, which sits in present-day Wakayama Prefecture. In the emaki, a priest named Anchin from the northeastern provinces of Japan is coming down to Wakayama to make pilgrimage to Kumano in southern Wakayama. While he's on his pilgrimage, he's staying at a government official's house, and while there, he falls in love with the official's daughter, who's named Kiyohime. This is a violation of the monk's vows of celibacy, so he lies to her, saying that he will come back to her after his pilgrimage, but instead, he decides to actually just steal away and go home. While he's on the road trying to desert her, she finds out about his plan to leave her high and dry, and she chases him down as he's crossing the Hidaka River. She jumps into the river, and while in the river, she transforms into a serpent yokai. She continues to chase him, and in order to escape her, the priest Anshin ran into the Dojoji temple grounds. The priests of Dojoji helped Anshin hide under a big temple bell in order to hide from Kiyohime. However, in her serpent form, she smells him under there, and so she coils around the bell and then spits fire on it, melting the bell and killing Anshin. This is a very famous story about avoiding temptation and not telling lies, and it also highlights another theme of the yokai, which is shapeshifting. Both Shutendoji and Kiyohime shapeshift in their stories. As part of their deception, many yokai can change form. This is evident in the lore surrounding another very famous kind of yokai, the nine-tailed fox, or the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Sometimes yokai shapeshift to kill, sometimes they shapeshift to prank somebody or otherwise trick them or lead them astray. Sometimes they shapeshift involuntarily. They all shapeshift in different ways and contexts. Shutendoji shapeshifted out of his true form whenever he passed out drunk. Kiyohime shapeshifted out of murderous, jilted lover rage. And Kitsune, specifically Kyuubi no Kitsune, are able to shapeshift in order to deceive and play tricks. Across several cultures, foxes are thought of as mysterious creatures. They make a strange noise, they look like a mix between a cat and a dog, and they're very quick and wily. So they often get ascribed these mysterious and sometimes supernatural characteristics. In Japanese myth, they can be omens of something momentous about to occur, they can be messengers of the kami, and they can be tricksters as well. When they're being depicted or talked about as yokai, the most common pranks and deceptions that they play on people will be tempting them to bathe in night soil, eat horse piles, and take payment for goods in leaves rather than in actual money. There's an entire subgenre of folktales devoted to kitsune mythology. One is the foxwife tale, where ancient and wise foxes become able to transform themselves into beautiful women, and then they deceive and hypnotize men for material gain, or just to kill them. Another motif is the fox jewel, or the magical jewel that's said to give the kitsune fox its powers. This jewel apparently sits in the tail, and this item is highly sought after because it can grant wishes or give the user powers of some kind. This jewel has a lot of similarities with the chintamani, or the wish-granting jewel in Buddhism. Let's continue working our way forward in Japanese history and talk about the Edo period, which lasted from 1600 to 1868. This period is thought of as the early modern period of Japanese history. As we've discussed, this period is marked by significant urbanization, by rulership of a military government, and by a population boom, but also by a literacy boom. One of the most remarkable characteristics of Japanese culture in this period is the explosion of print culture and print media. During this time, the advent of using woodblock printing for producing and reproducing images and text led to a huge increase in the production and consumption of books, magazines, early versions of manga, encyclopedias, manuals, and all manner of other publications. This fueled and was fueled by a literacy boom, and these booms brought with them a resurgence of interest in classical Japanese literature and the birth of a new genre of visual art, which we've discussed previously on the show, called ukiyo-e, or images of the floating world. This new interest in print culture and the burgeoning industry surrounding it commodified stories and their content, images both real and imagined, and motifs of visual art in a way that had not happened before in Japanese history. Copies of famous Japanese literature, like the Tale of Genji or courtly waka poetry from the Heian period, with colorful and artful illustrations, flew off the shelves. As a result, depictions of the yokai were simultaneously revitalized and reimagined. As there was a boom in the consumption of the printed word and the illustrated image, so too was there a boom in the fixation and the invention of oral and textual legends, myths, and folklore. These myths, legends, stories, folklore, classical literature were fixed into new comprehensive versions that came with convenient, colorful, mass-producible, and highly legible illustrations. Thus, many people's interpretations of the yokai started to become quite fixed. Their types, their appearance, their behavior, and their place and function in the stories and the folklore of Japan was standardized as it was written down and drawn. Naturally, of course, many yokai were also invented in various stories as well. As the yokai became further consumed in the printed word and in the illustrated image, naturally they also continued to be more and more fictionalized and narrativized. This built on the tradition of the emakimono and the monogatari literature, wherein the yokai were figures and characters in those stories. Now they were being reproduced as those stories were reproduced, and they were becoming more and more prominent figures as characters in those stories. Examples of yokai that were invented in the Edo period include the kasa obake, or the umbrella ghost. This is an example of a tsukumogami, or a tool or household item that's been possessed by the spirit of a kami or a yokai. The kasa obake looks like a closed umbrella, but it has an eye on it, 2 arms, and a single leg that it hops around on. There are hundreds of tsukumogami, some of which were invented in the Edo period and after, some of which were imagined prior. Other examples include animated musical instruments like the koto, the biwa, or the shamisen, as well as animated bits of cotton, aggregations of theater masks, mirrors, tea kettles, clocks, scrolls, sake jars, and more. In the Edo period and later depictions of the hyakki-yagyo, we begin to see illustrations of several of these tsukumogami participating and making a ruckus. Part of the construction of these tsukumogami has to do with the idea of playfully explaining why one might lose a household item or why it might not work properly. I left my umbrella by the front door and now it's gone. I don't remember putting it anywhere else, so it must have grown legs and walked away of its own accord. How did it grow those legs? Why did it walk away? It was possessed by a yokai. Another example of a yokai invented in the Edo period is the tofu kozo, or the tofu boy. The tofu boy is really interesting. He's a young boy bearing a tray of tofu or of sake in one hand and an umbrella in the other. He's fascinating because he doesn't do anything. He doesn't try to deceive or mess with humans. He isn't a good or bad omen of anything about to happen, and he doesn't communicate. He just sometimes follows people around on rainy nights. He's an example, and there are many others, of yokai that are invented in a playful and whimsical manner just to enrich literature and fiction. Thus, in the Edo period, the process of fictionalization and narrativization of the yokai continues from the medieval period, but we also begin to see a cartoonification, or a flanderization, you might say, of the yokai in literature. Sometimes they become a lot cuter and a lot more fun and comical in the way that they're depicted and in the way that we ought to understand them. And this is a big turn from prior in history when they were depicted as being scary or dangerous in some way. So to recap thus far, event has become object, where mysterious or unexplainable events have been categorized as yokai, and then object becomes personified or anthropomorphized, where object known as yokai becomes a creature or a figure in literature or in a story or in a religious cosmology known as a yokai. And then yokai become fictionalized or narrativized, where they're inserted as characters and figures with active roles and functions in stories and legends. And then, after becoming fictionalized, these figures become cartoonified. They've played these active roles in literature and in the legends that they're part of, and by the Edo period, they're being depicted as cute or comical or fun in some way. This doesn't take away from their sort of religious reality or from their potentially dangerous role and function, but it does speak to now they are being approached with the same kind of tongue-in-cheek, whimsical, and sometimes cynical approach that all kinds of Edo period art and literature has. So let's talk about the main genres of literature where the yokai come up in the Edo period. We can find roughly 3 main genres of literature that have depictions both narratively and visually of the yokai. The first one is kusazoshi, or illustrated picture books. This is a class of handheld woodblock printed pictures that fall into several subcategories depending on their content and their target market. Among kusazoshi, there were akahon, or red books, which were kind of like boys' comic books, aohon, or blue books, which contained summaries of plays, legends, and other stories, kurohon, or black books, which were stories adapted from popular dramas, the adventures of folk heroes, great battles, miracles, and tales from Buddhist and Shinto literature, gokan, or pleasure scrolls, which were pornographic in nature, and then kibyoshi, or yellow books, which were like comics for adults and served as one of the precursors to modern manga. All of these books contained depictions, illustrations, and presentations of the yokai in one context or the other. The second important genre of Edo period literature where the yokai figure very prominently is kaidan, or horror literature. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with the Japanese movie from the 1960s, Kwaidan. That movie was based originally on Lafcadio Hearn's 1904 book titled Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things, and that book was itself based originally on Ueda Akinari's 1776 collection of stories Ugetsu Monogatari, or Tales of Moonlight and Rain. Ugetsu Monogatari is actually a collection of 9 supernatural tales, all of which involve yokai, ghosts, spirits, or something similar. The movie ends up featuring only 3 of the 9 stories, but both the movie and the original Ugetsu Monogatari are very entertaining, and I highly recommend checking them out if you have the time. The movie Kwaidan was directed by one of my favorite Japanese directors of the 20th century, Masaki Kobayashi, and he's a fantastic filmmaker, and I highly recommend checking his stuff out. These types of literature, in many ways, partially constituted the birth of what we would now call popular culture in Japan. At the same time, they also went a long way toward cementing yokai as fixtures in Japanese everyday vernacular and as fixtures in that new and burgeoning popular culture. In doing so, as I've mentioned, the yokai became cartoonified and commodified. Whereas earlier in history they were considered a reality to be cautious of and the center of several important religious practices and ceremonies, in the Edo period they became fictional characters that played for entertainment and comedy and whimsy more so than for any moral or religious instruction. Religiosity was part of it, because the yokai don't exist outside of the context of Buddhism and Shinto, but the popularization of retellings of older literature and the creation of new literature featuring old and new invented yokai started the process of fictionalizing and narrativizing and cartoonifying the yokai in a way that they hadn't been before. This process of cartoonifying them or flanderizing them also vernacularized them into characters that we can talk about every day, the same way that we talk about characters in the West like Luke Skywalker. They're characters that we can feel close to, rather than these powerful and inscrutable deceivers or these mortally dangerous characters that live in the mountains or some such that we ought to be afraid of. Continuing in our historical narrative, that brings us to the Meiji and Showa eras, covering the period between 1868 and 1926. During this time period, Japan underwent lightning speed modernization and militarization in preparation for its imperial activity in the Pacific and in East Asia during the Asia-Pacific War. One of the guiding spirits at the core of this process was the construction and execution of the concept of nihonjin, or in English, what it actually means to be Japanese. What the cultural, racial, religious, ethnic, and political identities of being Japanese actually dictated. The construction of the Japanese identity in the midst of colonial and military activity resulted in further construction and standardization of all aspects of Japanese culture, from language to religion to literature and folklore. This construction and execution and standardization of Japanese culture took place by means of Western-style scholarship in many cases, which was just being imported to Japan at the time. Enter Kunio Yanagita. Kunio Yanagita was the father of modern Japanese folklore studies. He lived from 1875 to 1962, and his studies revolved mostly around the oral folklore and legends that circulated around rural communities in Japan. This application of Western scholarship to folklore blazed a great deal of the trail that I'm treading on in this episode. Without his work, I wouldn't be able to talk about the yokai in the manner that I have thus far. However, we should mention that Yanagita's work was not without its flaws. Primary among them is that in many ways it replicated the methods of participant observation and ethnography that European imperial powers in the 19th century used to make sweeping claims about the cultures and peoples that they wanted to colonize and exploit for their resources. In that regard, the scholarship that came out of that was ideologically pointed towards justifying that colonial activity. However, in this case, Yanagita's work was not oriented towards justifying why Japan should exploit and conquer and colonize itself. Rather, it was aimed at the construction and sacralization of the identity of Japaneseness. It depicted Japanese culture and folklore as having all of these very deep, essential characteristics and all of these wonderful traits that set it apart from other cultures. It contributed a great deal to the problematic idea of Japanese exceptionalism, which pervades even to this day, and served as a justification for a great deal of Japan's own imperial and colonial activities in the Asia-Pacific War. In addition, Yanagita's application of the methods that I've discussed were not perfect either. Folklore is heavily defined by teller, audience, geography, and time. Versions of stories change drastically depending on who's telling them, who they're telling the stories to, where the teller and audience are from, and what time period you're in. This is true to an extra extent in the case of oral tales. Oral tales change in every telling. Thus, pinning down an unchanging or unmoving fixture in those stories is hard, if not impossible, because sometimes there isn't an unchanging or unmoving fixture. You can sit down and talk to 1,000 farmers from different places all around Japan and write down their telling of a particular myth, but you can't make any larger claims about all Japanese folklore across time and geography based on what they've told you without making some very big and problematic leaps. All you can really do is speak to what all those farmers said at the time that you heard the tale from them. That's useful, but it's not exhaustive or applicable outside of its own context. The danger of bias is everywhere. There's the danger of bias in the very activity of seeking to understand and describe and categorize and make claims about this thing that we call Japanese folklore. Folklore changes person to person, group to group, region to region, and so making any grand or sweeping claims about it is just impossible. Then there's bias in the claims that are being made, which, as we've discussed, can possibly lead to Japanese exceptionalism, Japanese nationalism, and an overall inaccurate depiction of what Japanese folklore is all about. Finally, there's even also the danger of bias in the people telling the stories that Yanagita will eventually write down. They also bring their personal biases and their agendas and their ideologies in the way that they're carrying out their lives and telling those stories. And so it's possible that the oral tales that Yanagita is writing down are also being presented with ideas of Japanese nationalism or exceptionalism or pro-imperial sentiment in mind. There's just too many variables at play for this to not be, overall, kind of a dangerous and imperfect activity of scholarship. That doesn't mean, however, that Yanagita's work is entirely a poisoned well. There's lots to see in it that's very interesting and very worthwhile. We just have to take it all with a grain of salt and understand the time and context of not only Yanagita and his work, but also the people that he talked to and the sources that he used to get these stories from. So, continuing to move forward, we've arrived into the most recent century of Japanese history, and we're beginning to see that the yokai have become objects of cultural attention in Japan rather than subjects of Japanese folklore and literature like they were in the pre-modern period. They've made the move from spiritual or religious reality to fictionality, or even cartoonification. They've gone from religious reality to entertainment. In the 20th century, with the birth of modern manga, we begin to see more and more yokai being invented and taking on character roles in fictional narratives. With manga like Gakugei no Kitaro, Yu Yu Hakusho, Inuyasha, Yokai Watch, and more, yokai continue to exist in the cultural imagination and take on ever more deep and complicated character roles in fiction. They also continue to be invented. Shigeru Mizuki, for example, the author of Gakugei no Kitaro and a folklorist himself, claims to have invented 30 yokai in his works. The yokai began to take on a similar role and position in popular culture that orcs and elves and stuff have taken in Western popular culture due to the work of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien was drawing on a lot of pre-modern English mythology and Scottish and Irish mythology when he was creating the elves and the orcs and the hobbits. And so just the same as in the case of yokai, they went from being scary and dangerous fixtures in an indigenous religious tradition to being these fictional characters played for entertainment, and then becoming even more cartoonified. That brings us to the 1980s and 90s, and the birth of character goods, merchandise, and what we would now call cool Japan. This was a period of economic boom that led to the invention of highly merchandisable and franchisable characters and toys, like Hello Kitty, Gundam, Doraemon, and more. The cartoonified and commodified yokai were perfectly suited to this economic and cultural moment. For one, Japanese culture, media, goods, and more were all the rage internationally. The Japanese economic boom was being driven in part by the export of manufactured Japanese goods like computers, cars, home appliances, and more. Similarly, manga, anime, toys, and more were taking off internationally as well. On the other hand, the yokai had also become something of a pride point for Japanese people. They had become a mythical or legendary class of creatures or spirits in Japanese culture that the people had come to adore and relate with and think of as a uniquely Japanese entity. So it made perfect sense for the yokai to figure heavily in the media, the merchandise, and the culture that was being consumed in Japan and internationally. Thus, the yokai figured ever more in manga, anime, Japanese toys, and Japanese media that was being exported to the West and beyond. Examples of media imported to the West in the 80s and 90s that featured yokai and yokai-inspired creatures are almost impossible to exhaustively list, but they include famous franchises like Hunter x Hunter, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, Bleach, Pompoko, Gegege no Kitaro, Yu Yu Hakusho, Inuyasha, Yokai Watch, Dororo, and more. I personally grew up on several of these pieces of media, and so I'd like to discuss some of the yokai that figure in them. First, I opened the episode discussing how many Pokemon have origins as yokai. u/ombrebacks on Reddit has started a list of Pokemon and their corresponding yokai. This list is composed of yokai that these Pokemon bear superficial similarity to and may draw some inspiration from. This list is not my own, and I cannot speak to the veracity of some of the equivalencies drawn on this list. For example, just because there may be a superficial similarity between one Pokemon and one yokai, we can't actually say for sure that that yokai inspired the creation of that Pokemon. But we can at least say that they look similar and they may have a relationship. Still, I would like to share some figures for it nonetheless, all credit to the Reddit user who put it together. This list isn't exhaustive, so if you have a Pokemon that you're sure is inspired by the yokai, let me know in the comments. Starting with Gen 1 Pokemon, of course we've said Vulpix and Ninetales are inspired heavily by the Kyuubi no Kitsune. This is obvious, and those Pokemon couldn't really be anything else. Growlithe and Arcanine seem to be inspired by the Koma Inu, or the Goryo dog. Goryo is a Korean kingdom where these dog yokai as protector beings came about. We have Slowbro, who seems to be inspired by the Sazae Oni, or the shellfish demon. Grimer and Muck look to be inspired by the Dorotabo, or the muddy rice field guy. Ghastly looks to be inspired by Sogenbi, or the Sogen fire. Executor looks to be inspired by the Ninmenju, or the human-faced tree. Lickitung looks to be inspired by the Akaname, or the filth licker. Jinx looks to be inspired by the Yamauba, or the mountain hag. Gyarados looks to be inspired by the Wani, a water dragon. And Moltres looks to be inspired by the Sujaku, or the Suzaku, the vermilion bird. Looking at Gen 2, Espeon seems to be inspired by the Nekomata, or the two-tailed cat monster. This is one of my favorite yokai, and we'll discuss more about it later. Misdreavus seems to be inspired by the Rokurokubi, or the Nukekubi. Gligar seems to be inspired by the Amikiri, or the net cutter. Sneasel seems to be inspired by the Kama-Itachi, or the sickle weasel. Smoochun seems to be inspired by Kintaro, the golden boy. Kintaro was a folk hero who was raised by a mountain hag, or a Yamauba. Suicune seems to be inspired by a Kirin, or a Japanese-style unicorn, who also features in the Monster Hunter series of video games. Lugia seems to be inspired by Ryūhei, a dragon god, and Celebi seems to be inspired by Kodama, or tree spirits that factor heavily also in the Studio Ghibli film Princess Mononoke. Looking at Gen 3, Blaziken seems to be inspired by the Garuda, a Hindu origin creature, which is rendered in Japanese as Karura. Zigzagoon seems to be inspired by the Bake Danuki, or the ghost raccoon dog, or the ghost tanuki. Lombre and Ludicolo both seem to be inspired by the Kappa, or this frog river guy. Mawile seems to bear some similarity to the Furakuchi Onna, or the two-mouthed woman. Whiscash seems to be inspired by the Onamazu, the giant catfish. Banette is actually a canonical Tsukumogami. The Pokédex description literally says that Banette is a Tsukumogami doll. Duskull seems to be inspired by the Chochin Obake. This is a paper lantern ghost, which is definitely a Tsukumogami. Dusclops seems to be inspired by the Hitotsume Kozo, or the one-eyed priest. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, we're also going to see the Hitotsume giant, or the one-eyed giant, similarly inspired not only by the Greek Cyclops, but also by the Hitotsume Yōkai. Chimecho seems to be inspired by the Furi Neko, or the wind chime cat. This is a Tsukumogami of a wind chime that just behaves like a cat. Absol seems to be inspired by the Hakutaku, or the white marsh. Snorunt seems to be inspired by the Yukinko, or the snow child, or snow boy. Clam Pearl seems to be inspired by the Shinkiro, or the clam breather tower. And Rayquaza is, of course, inspired by the Tatsu, a dragon. This list continues through to Gen 7, but I'll leave it there for now. It's very interesting, and I highly recommend that you take a look if you have the time. Let's transition to looking at Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters that were very likely inspired by Yōkai. This list is also not exhaustive, and it's not my own. It comes from u/Glaubenturter on Reddit, and it includes both American TCG cards as well as Japanese OCG cards, some of which may not have a Western release, or some of which may have a forthcoming Western release. Again, here, if you want to talk about monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! That have obvious Yōkai inspiration, let me know in the comments. We have the Yatagarasu, or the 8-span crow. This is a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! And also a god in the Shinto mythology. We have Gozuki and Mezuki. This is the ox head and horse face yokai, which play a role in the Taiheki and in other monogatari literature. We have the crow Tengu, as well as other Tengu-based monsters, such as the Great Longnose and Reborn Tengu and Crow Goblin, and probably Spirit of the Books as well. We have Monster Cat, likely based on the Bakeneko. We have a nine-tailed fox, also based on the Kitsune from before. We have the Wall of Illusion. This one is interesting. There's a yokai in Japanese lore called the Nurikabe, and there's also a Nurikabe card, by the way. And this is apparently like an invisible wall that shows up and kind of blocks people from going where they're trying to go. It's like an invisible barrier that you sometimes used to hit in older video games when you got to the edge of the map. There's, of course, also a Shuten Doji card, which is very interesting. There's a Jirai Gumo from early on in the franchise, and this is a pun. Jirai means landmine, and then the original name of the yokai is Joro Gumo. The Joro Gumo is a shape-shifting spider that sometimes takes the form of a woman with several arms. Next we have Shiranui, which is an archetype of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, and its origin is actually as this personified, mysterious atmospheric phenomenon called ghost lights. There's a card called Night of 100 Horrors, which is based on the Hyakki Yagyo. There's cards Suijin and Kazejin, which are inspired by the Shinto gods Shuijin and Fujin. There's the Ojama cards, which are based on the everyday Japanese word meaning a bother or a nuisance, and of course many others. Again, none of these lists are exhaustive, but their size should speak to the fact that yokai are everywhere in Japanese media and culture. They've become commodified into collectible card games and fictionalized into manga, anime, and live-action television and movies, and they've been cartoonified as part of that process. Now that we're reaching the conclusion of the episode, I just wanted to share some of my favorite yokai that we didn't get to mention, and share what their lore or their characteristics are like. I think that these yokai are super fun and interesting, and they figure in some interesting stories. So let's get started here. First, let's look at the nekomata. This is a shape-shifting cat that has 2 tails, can sometimes walk around on 2 feet, and speaks human language rather than just saying meow. These cats are often confused with bakeneko, which translates to ghost or monster cat, and they sometimes are thought to be a subtype of bakeneko. Regardless, the biggest difference is that the nekomata has 2 tails and the bakeneko only has 1. In both cases, though, the nekomata or the bakeneko is a cat that has grown very old and has undergone a supernatural or preternatural change, and this results in them attaining supernatural powers, such as the ability to walk on 2 feet and speak human language. When they make this change, they can become very mischievous and dangerous. Next, we have the kuchisake onna. This translates to slit-mouthed woman, and it's one of several different types of malicious spirits called onryo. The onryo can have overlap with the yokai in many cases. The kuchisake onna is typically a very tall woman spirit who covers her face partially with a mask, and she carries a knife or a pair of scissors around with her. She'll go up to people and ask if they think that she's pretty. If they say no, she'll kill them on the spot with her scissors. If they say yes, she'll remove her mask and she'll show that her mouth is actually slit from ear to ear, and she'll smile real big and ask again if they think that she's pretty. If the person says no, she'll cut the person entirely in half. If they say yes, but hesitate or seem unsure, she'll cut their mouth to look like hers. Apparently, she's the evil spirit of a woman who was mutilated by her husband in life for not smiling enough, and we love a woman getting justice in the afterlife. Next, we have the tanuki. A tanuki is an actual animal, known as the Japanese raccoon dog. However, similarly to the bakeneko or the nekomata, they're thought to be able to undergo a supernatural change that gives them the power to shapeshift or possess humans. There's a whole Studio Ghibli movie based on the premise called Pompoko. The tanuki are having their habitat destroyed by construction and development in the area, and so they get back at the humans by shapeshifting into them or possessing them in order to sabotage their efforts. Next we have the jubokko. This is a yokai tree that is said to grow on battlefields and live on the human blood spilled in the soil. When it runs out of blood in the soil, it'll capture passers-by and suck their blood out. Since it lives entirely on human blood, it's said that it bleeds red when the bark or the branches are cut. I really like this one because it actually doesn't have a historical origin. It was invented by Shigeru Mizuki in his fictional works. Many yokai were invented this way in the 20th century. Next we have the Yuki Onna. This translates to snow woman. This is a very prevalent yokai in Japanese folklore. She's a woman with very pale skin, and she appears either clothed or naked to passers-by out of the snow. She'll talk to the men and tempt them into letting her into their house, or sometimes even tempting them to commit to marriage or stuff like that. In almost all cases, when she gets to the house, she attempts to warm herself somehow because her skin is very cold to the touch, and she's either naked out in the snow or underdressed. So she'll get by a hearth or get into a warm bath, but then when she does, she disappears in a swirl of snow, or she melts in the bath. In other versions of stories involving the Yuki Onna, she'll be a vengeful ghost of a woman who was deceived and murdered in wintertime, and so came back as a snow woman to get back at those who wronged her. In this kind of story, you may see a Yuki Onna appear out in the snow hugging a child, and she'll ask a passerby to hug the child to try and warm him. But if you do hug the child, then you'll slowly freeze to death. This is kind of a mythologized explanation of hallucinations that someone might experience when they start to get hypothermia and freeze to death. I love the vengeful women yokai because it's fun to imagine that women who were badly wronged or mistreated by men or by their husbands in life get their happy ending by being vengeful ghosts or spirits in the afterlife. This vengeful woman plot surrounding the Yuki Onna was reinterpreted into the 1973 Japanese film Lady Snowblood, or as it's called in Japanese, Shurayuki Hime, where the main character Yuki takes vengeance on 3 men who raped her mother and killed her half-brother. This movie, interestingly, served as Quentin Tarantino's primary inspiration for the movie Kill Bill. So, it turns out there's actually a connection between the yokai and Quentin Tarantino movies. That's the connection that I teased earlier in the episode. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism, discussing the yokai. I hope that you enjoyed the episode and learned a lot, and I hope that you can find lots of yokai out there to learn about and be entertained by. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.